Hello, this is another episode of the Austin Bar Association's Stop the Stigma podcast. If you recall, this year my initiative has been to stop the stigma. My plan is to change the conversations that we have around mental health and substance abuse in order to save at least one life. Today, we have Kurt Metscher here to discuss his journey in recovery. Hello, Kurt. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. Can you tell us a little backstory about your journey?
Sure. I got sober at I think a relatively young age when I was 22. I had a totally, I think average home life growing up. There is a history of alcoholism in my family, but it seems like if this happens, it skipped a generation. Neither of my parents were active alcoholics or addicts. And it escalated. My use of drugs and alcohol escalated very, very quickly, beginning at the age of 15 and then up until I was around 21, 22, when I kind of peaked.
What led you to want to share your story today?
Well, I've been sober for almost 15 years, and during that period of time, I got sober in a correctional facility, and that's where I spent the first 6 or 7 months of my sobriety. And after that, I lived in a sober house for 8 months. And very slowly, I got a job putting tables. I went to Austin Community College and eventually transferred to St. Edward's, and then eventually applied to law school and became an attorney. Throughout all of that, it's been consistently important to me to have a level of openness with other people, not just because that's kind of intrinsic to sort of the 12-step recovery program, but also as I kind of like grew up and became an adult and also became involved in a profession. It felt like it was important to be really open about my background and my experience for practical reasons, but also hopefully to make other people feel more comfortable, maybe just in their own skin, maybe with their experience, or ideally reaching out for help if they need it.
Well, before we went on camera and started recording, you and I were talking a little bit, and I talked about how, for me, sharing what my story and what I've been through has been very healing for me. Went through some pretty traumatic experiences. And obviously the goal of this Stop the Stigma is to save a life. And they always say, telling your story can save a life. And you told me a catchy phrase that I really liked. Can you repeat that?
Well, yeah, I think it's a little bit corny, but it is something. Sometimes these things work. Cliches exist for a reason, but that that we have this idea of wanting to help other people, save other people, and I think that the corny thing that I mentioned was if the only life you save is your own, that's okay. That is totally valid goal to have, and I think, especially in early recovery, that is the goal. Like you were saying, that is you. And there's something also self-serving, I think, inherently in being open about my experience with alcoholism and addiction, because, as you said, it is healing to discuss these things. It is healing to do something that you think might help other people. That helps me, and I have deliberately put that into practice over the past 15 years, and I think that it has helped.
Is that how long you've been sober? 15 years?
It'll be 15 years in July.
Congratulations. Talk to me, what were your substances of choice when you were in active addiction?
I think surprisingly, my number one was always marijuana. That was, and I say surprisingly because most people don't think of that as a drug that can ruin your life. For me, I can't. There are plenty of people out there that can use marijuana normally, just like they can drink alcohol socially. I cannot. I just can't. And that went hand in hand with other substances to me. Generally, amphetamines and other kinds of speed, essentially, were my drugs of choice.
How old were you when you started?
When the very first time I ever tried any drug, I was 15.
And then you mentioned you got sober when you were in a correctional facility. Um, how old were you at that point?
I was 22.
Okay, so you were in 7 years of active addiction.
Yes, 7 years.
And did it over time? I mean, they call addiction, they also call recovery a progressive, you know, but addiction is a progressive disease. Over time, how did you see your use change? Or did you see your use change?
I mean, over time, my use certainly did change. It was absolutely progressive. Um, I would say, well, one, I got out of my parents' house and I went to college in Colorado, which is when I really kind of, well, I actually got into a lot of trouble there. Um, and then eventually moved back to Texas and was here in Austin in active addiction for a couple of years. And that is when it progressed very, very quick, like exponentially almost. It was, well, looking back, it became a feeling of constant desperation. The priorities in my life were very, very clear, and it was really just obtaining and using substances.
Um, what can I ask you what happened that landed you in your correctional facility?
Definitely. So I went to the University of Colorado Boulder when I graduated from high school here, and
Which, by the way, is absolutely stunningly beautiful landscape.
incredible school. It's the campus is amazing. I was in the music program there, which they have an excellent music program. I played the trumpet, and I probably shouldn't. I wasn't ready to be to be in that independent of a situation. Um, I got into a lot of trouble on campus. My friend and I shared some LSD, and my friend had a very bad experience and ended up running around campus and got arrested. I was very worried about him because I couldn't find him. And I asked my, at the time, dorm mate for help. And he called the campus police. And at that point, I was so worried about my friend that I was when the police arrived, and I was like, here's what happened. We took LSD. Please help him. Like, I'm really worried that he's going to like run in front of traffic or something. And of course they were like, okay, well, you're under arrest also. Um, and I think that something had happened, something similar involving hallucinogens to happen on that campus in the past like 6 months before we ever got there in our incoming class. And they were very sensitive about this. And so the reaction by the administration was like, you're for sure kicked out. And the reaction by the campus police was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, we're charging you with 3 felonies. So that's the first part of the answer to the question. So, I entered into a deferred adjudication deal with the court in Colorado, who allowed me to move back to Texas, as long as I, went into inpatient treatment in Texas, and I got registered with in Travis County we call it adult supervision, which is probation here in Travis County for 4 years. So the reason that I got sober in a correctional facility is because eventually I stopped reporting to my probation officer. Eventually I'd done in and out of different treatment centers, in and out of different sober houses. Finally, I was kicked out of a sober house for not being sober, which is, of course, that's the point, right?
And it's also, that's not uncommon. It's not like most people just, oh, I think, now some people do. Some people do say, I'm going to get sober, but, you know, I've been through the whole rehab family week and everything. And in many instances, they say studies show that sometimes it takes 7 visits before it sticks, you know, and that's pretty common, right? To be in and out.
Right. And I was in and out quite a bit. But the last time I think my parents had been attending Al-Anon, which was, I think, an integral part to this story that I wasn't a part of, that I didn't see, because their reaction when I was kicked out of a sober house the last time was to say, okay, well, you're cut off. Like, we're like, you can't come back to the house. We changed the locks. Like, you're on your own. We just can't support this anymore. And that was at the time, felt bad. But looking back, a crucial part of me, what they say, like hitting rock bottom and having like a bad enough experience that I could shake myself, free of what I was kind of locked into. So I was homeless here in Austin, just down the street for quite a while, and during that period, I I stopped reporting to my probation officer. I also stopped taking my antidepressants cold turkey, which with never a good idea, specifically with what I was prescribed, legitimately prescribed. You can't stop taking the cold turkey. But I certainly wasn't going to spend money on a copay for a prescription when I have everywhere to live. I needed money for drugs, and there was at the time you could get for 75 cents a little container of rice from Veggie Heaven. I don't know if that place is still there, but that's what I was doing for quite a while. Eventually, well, they don't like it if you don't report to probation, so eventually I'd convinced a friend of mine to let me crash on his couch for the night. And when I woke up in the morning, one of my buddies came in and was like, "Hey, there's someone at the door for you." And I remember I was like, "You told someone I was here?" Because I was aware, like, I'm in violation. If they find me, I'll get arrested. And the deal with deferred adjudication is if they revoke your probation, it defaults to the original indictment charge, which is 3 felonies. So I was like, I just can't this just can't happen. So I go to the door, and it's my probation officer. And apparently she, her background was as a licensed chemical dependency counselor. And I don't think it's standard practice for a probation officer to go and find someone when they've gone off the grid. But yeah, she was at the door, and she was like, "Hey, what's going on?" And I just kind of like broke down, and I was like, "I don't know. I think I'm killing myself. Like I don't know what to do." And she was like, "Okay, well, here's what our options are," and it's really just one option. We can go and see the judge, and I don't recall his name, whoever was in charge of the Travis County Drug Diversion Court at the time. And if he's okay with it, then we can do this, and you'll do a period of time in Del Valley, and then afterwards there'll be some extra restrictions on sober living and drug testing and things like that. So that's your choice. Or like you can just get revoked. So I said, okay.
That's incredible. So she saved your life.
She did, and I've called her. I haven't called her in a few years, but I used to call her fairly I called her when I graduated from law school, to let her know that I have a feeling that they don't have a ton of great outcomes in the probation department.
Well, yeah, right. Especially if people don't show up for probation.
Yeah. So I made a point every few years to reach out again.
That's nice. You mentioned Al-Anon. I'll say that I'm a grateful member of Al-Anon for, I think this year is my 12th year. And I just had an anniversary in April. But I wanted to say this in defense of Al-Anon. It sounded like Al-Anon told your parents to lock you out of the house, and that's not what they teach, right? They just teach boundaries because people, especially parents, want so desperately to help you and save you, right? And sometimes what they do, they enable you to get worse. And sometimes it just takes locking the door and locking people out. And oftentimes it does work. And oftentimes it doesn't. You just have to take that final step, and I call it draw the line in the sand and stick to it. And I can't imagine how hard that was for your parents.
That's the thing, is I can't either. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to understand how hard that was for them.
Hopefully never, right?
Yeah, hopefully never. It's something that I've certainly put a lot of thought into in sobriety of what that must have been like for them. And I've expressed to them the value of doing that for me, right? And I know that their intuition was always to help in whatever way they can. And sometimes enforcing boundaries doesn't feel like helping. And I can't imagine how difficult that was. But if they hadn't done that, I don't know that things would have worked out the same way. So while Al-Anon certainly doesn't say like, hey, if you know an addict, alcoholic, just lock them out, like that's probably not in the literature. But like you said, boundaries are important and can be really difficult to enforce. As an addict, I will take an active addiction. I will take and take and take and take.
It progresses over and over. I mean, it just keeps getting worse. It does not get better. until you surrender, right? And I'll say this too, like, Al-Anon follows the 12 steps just like AA does. Are you in AA now?
I got sober in AA. I'm not quite as active as I used to be, but that was the framework for my sobriety.
And the whole concept is I admitted I was powerless over alcohol or over the alcoholic. And it's a complete surrender on both sides, right? Because we think we can help people and fix people. And quite frankly, that's a little bit of a narcissistic thought, right? I mean, people are in charge of themselves and the choices they make and the consequences from their choices. So you went to the Del Valley, and during that time, they put you in another sobriety program.
Right. I had access to AA style meetings once a week. And then I also was required to attend classes in, I remember it was called Promoting Pro-Social Behavior. And there's a textbook and everything. So it was not fun, but it was a very controlled environment. And it's kind of the place where I feel like, looking back now, where I became a person.
Yeah. What do you think clicked at that point? There's like, okay, I'm finally this is sticking,
Actually, it didn't, because and I don't want to take the wind out of your sails, but I remember this very clearly, because during that time I thought, okay, 7 months, I can pretend for 7 months, and then and if I got through that, I only had like a year and a half of probation left. So in my mind, I'm sitting, in Del Valley, in my mind, I'm like, okay, I could pretend I can get through 7 months, do all this stuff. It's check boxes, and then just a year and a half, then I can get high again. Like, I just have to learn what I need to say so that they'll be happy with me. And then I'll have the latitude to do what I want to do. And I also thought, and if at the end of this, like, I knew I never wanted to go back to jail, right? I knew, like, that I cannot let that happen. So I'll fake it the whole time, right? And part of me, I actually did think, like, and if by the time I'm done with probation, so out of the shadow of jail being a possibility, if that's just my life at that point, then fine, whatever. But to be clear, my plan was just to pretend until I was out of the woods. So it didn't, you asked when it clicked for me. I don't think it clicked for me then, but I was aware of the potential of faking it till you make it. But my intention was truly to deceive as many people as possible for as long as I could.
Which is also fairly common with a lot of addicts. They think it for, and quite frankly, they're just lying to themselves, right? But that's a realization. Yeah. Other people know, especially people that are around it. It's quite a fascinating experience to go through. I'll say that. But so when did when did you finally say, okay, I like this lifestyle, this is better?
I moved into a sober house. When I was released, my mother picked me up at Del Valley, and I owned one thing. I owned a 2001 Volkswagen Jetta. And we went and sold it to one of her friends so that their kid could have their first car. And so I had like $8,000, and I entered it to my mom, and I was like, here you go. Please give this to the guy that owns the sober house. And so I paid rent in advance for like 9 months of a sober house, and then had my parents hold on to all the rest of the cash from that car sale.
Oh, I didn't realize you had to pay rent at a sober house.
Oh, you do, and it's certainly much higher than it would ever. I mean, you're crammed in a room with, like, at a men's sober house, like 4 or 5 other guys in bunk beds usually. And so I prepaid the rent, and I was just like, okay, I got this. I don't have any money that I can use for anything. And sober houses have rules. There's a structure there. You have to go to meetings.
Do you do tests? Do you have to do the test, drug test or alcohol test?
Rules are different at all different houses. Usually at the beginning, they test you regularly. And then after a while, it's like, hey, if we think maybe something's going on, which happens somewhat frequently. And so eventually, I got a job waiting tables at the what used to be the TGI Fridays at the Radisson Hotel on.
Yes, I forgot all about that. Wow, on the lake.
Yes. So I would walk there almost every day and wait tables. And I was going to, between 1 and 3 AA meetings a day.
Back then, though, that was a happening place. That's where everybody downtown ate lunch.
Yes, and it was one of the best places to watch the bats come out from under the bridge. So it was, I had waited tables before. That was one of my, employable skills. So I could
That's
do
one of your
it.
core skills at that point.
It was also being around, it was also my first time being around alcohol a whole bunch and being back into the food service industry, which if you've ever worked in the food service industry, there is a culture that's very, very accepting of drug use. And sometimes that's negative, sometimes that's positive in a permissive, non-judgmental way. But for someone like me, my experience with food service industry culture largely was let's get high before, during, and after work. So anyways, I went and started waiting tables, and I had basically a really simple life. I would go to meetings, I would wait tables, and I would check in at the sober house, and that was it. After a few months, I re-enrolled in Austin Community College, and I had started to form actual friendships with other people around my age. And I think, and this is a very long way of answering your question of when it clicked. I got sober in the same city that I did the majority of my drug use. And I read this, and I can't remember where it came from. I can look it up later, and we can maybe add a link or something. But a wonderful article about being in recovery in the same place where you used to use, and walking past familiar places that you see in a totally different light than you used to. And it's the author called it the phantasmagorial sort of prism through which you view. And for me, that's many, many places in Austin.
Yeah, or going through a portal and you're on the other side of it. It's any other thing. Because when you were talking, I know people in recovery who can't go back because they can't go back to where they were using because they get sucked back into that culture.
And that was a real concern for me, even over time. I was lucky to try to get sober in Austin because there's a vibrant recovery community here, especially for young people. I was lucky to try getting sober at the same time as some very specific people that I was able to form close bonds with. And that feeling of being two people, or that feeling of being a fake version of the real me, started to fade over time. And when it clicked is when I realized that I was enjoying my life, as opposed to what I was accustomed to previously. Was that I had no intention of surviving past the age of 25 or 26. I didn't want to. I hated myself. I resented every decision I had made. And eventually I found myself in a position where I was I think I like this. I think that this is good.
There's a lot of shame and guilt in addiction, right? That's one of the big things you have to overcome. Is that right?
100%. One of the biggest things for me, even in long-term recovery, is, and this is through 12-step program and individual therapy, is coming to terms with just the idea that I might be a good person.
Yeah, you're a great person.
And that's that logically, yeah, that makes sense. But there's something built in, I think, with how people who have experienced substance use disorder, alcoholism, addiction, I don't know what it is, but it's the same kind of voice that tells me that doing drugs is going to fix everything, is that I'm not good enough, I'm not a good person. And then the only thing that you see are well, here's all the evidence of why you're not a good person. You did this, a good person would never do these things. Now, that doesn't logically follow, of course. But it's been that's been a part of long-term recovery is just being willing to be okay with the idea that I might be a good person.
Let's talk a little bit about AA. We've mentioned that. Let's say someone's listening to this and they're thinking, maybe I need to go to an AA meeting and just check it out. Where do they start?
No matter what city you're in, there are almost definitely AA meetings in that city. there is usually an intergroup website for whatever city you're in. And if you live somewhere out in the country, the next closest place. I've been to AA meetings and in towns with populations under 1,000. So they're everywhere. My suggestion would be to just show up and listen. And if you think it's dumb and you think it's cheesy, pick a different one and go show up to that one and listen.
It does take time to find your right meeting, right?
It does. And I think, unfortunately, it requires a level of open-mindedness that is a lot to ask of someone who's in pain and has unmet needs, who's struggling with substance use. Which is why you hear so many stories about like, well, I had no choice. I had to go to the meeting, had them sign my card, right? There are plenty of meetings out there that I don't care for. There are meetings out there that I think are bad, that people shouldn't, that nobody should go to, right? And I think reasonable minds could probably disagree on the subjectivity of which meetings are good and which are not. Eventually, I found the kind of meeting that worked for me, where I was around people who, it was mostly young people because I was 22, where I felt safe, where I felt like I was hearing things from people who had been sober longer than I had, and they represented an idea that I wanted to aspire to.
Right. What's your home group?
Initially, it was a group here in Austin called the Liars Club.
Oh, I love that name. That's good.
And we had a meeting, and it's not in existence anymore. It was called Brothers of the Fourth Dimension, and it was a men's meeting, pretty much comprised of people from the age of 18 to 30, basically. And then when I got to Baylor Law School, we actually started a meeting at the law school.
Yeah, that's nice. Well, that's great. Yeah, my home group for Al-Anon is in Westlake, and I kind of like you, went a lot at first, and then you kind of slow down because it just becomes a way of life, right? You learn to stop enabling, and you learn how to live without using, right, and learn how to change your way of thinking. So you finished this, and then now how old are you?
Right now?
Yeah.
I'm 36.
36, and you're a lawyer.
No, I am. No.
Let's talk about how that happened.
I get the question a lot, like, well, what made you decide to become a lawyer? Have you always wanted to be a lawyer? And I think it says on my bio on the firm website that I used to want to be an astronaut, that I never wanted to be a lawyer. And it's true. I never wanted to be a lawyer. Which is not to say I'm not happy to be one now, but it just wasn't my plan. And when I transferred to St. Edward's, I was studying political science and foreign policy, and I wanted to become an analyst. I found out eventually that there was no way I would ever be able to get security clearance. I could never work for the agency. I could never work even for a private intelligence firm. So I kind of had to figure out what I wanted to do next, which I guess I could have figured this out before. But without being able to get security clearance, I couldn't go into the field of foreign policy that I wanted to. So I started looking into law school, and I don't remember making a decision. I remember I paid the deposit for the LSAT and started studying for it, and just kind of kept putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, that's what it takes, right? Every day of our lives. It continues today. So talk to me about character and fitness, because that's a tough, rigorous process when you're going to sit for the bar exam. So how did that work for you?
So for me, quite a bit of time had passed already by the time I was applying. And, there's I think 3 or 4 different points at which you have to disclose any conduct related to character and fitness. And so for me, it was saying, hey, this happened in 2007, and then my probation was discharged 4 years later, and like I had to pull all these records from Colorado and records from Texas, and I just had to kind of collect everything to substantiate what I was saying. And so that's part of the law school application process, and that's when the disclosure starts, because that has to match what you put in when you apply to the bar. And your declaration of intent to study law and all that. So finally, I graduated law school, and I remember I was getting ready to study for the bar, and I got a letter saying, hey, and I got a letter from the bar And I was like, hey, how's it going? You're not morally fit to practice law. Like, we've reviewed your documentation, and you're not good enough.
3 felonies ain't gonna cut it, buddy. But you didn't have felonies, though. But it's still on your record.
Deferred adjudication usually involves a plea deal, right? So those were pled down to one misdemeanor. I've never practiced criminal law, so I don't understand exactly how it works.
I was gonna ask you, do you practice criminal law now?
No, I practice family law now.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was actually pled down to a misdemeanor. So because I completed my probation, that's the way it remained. And I've actually since had the all of that sealed. Not that it matters to the bar or to the government, but in any case, I got a letter that's saying, "Hey, you're not morally fit." And they it's very short, and they say, "But if you want to have a hearing about it, you're entitled to. Just let us know. We'll set a hearing." I was like, "Yeah."
I just spent 3 years in law school. Do you have any idea like how tired and exhausted I am after all of this?
So I got in contact with an attorney here in Austin, Claude Duclos, who does some or did at the time some character and fitness work, and just kind of got ready for the character and fitness hearing. It honestly wasn't as I was very stressed out. I thought maybe I'd just gone to law school for no reason.
No, right? And spent all that money.
But I think it was good evidence of the idea of notice and hearing as a concept of process, right? We met up with a committee at the Texas Supreme Court building, and they asked me a bunch of questions, and I answered them on the record, and they said, "Okay, thank you for your time." And then I got a letter like a week later that said,
"Just kidding, you are morally fit.
You're good to go." So I know everyone's experience is different. But the key really is fully disclosing everything.
Honesty.
Yes.
Especially if you've changed and moved past those ways, and just be honest.
And I think it's substance use disorder is not a moral failing.
No, it's not.
No, it's an unmet mental health issue when someone's in active addiction. I think that what the character and fitness portion of what that function is really more geared towards looking at people who have committed fraud and embezzlement. Murder would probably be, yeah. I think they're looking for they call it crimes of moral turpitude, right? And I know there are different viewpoints on this. To me, mental health, which alcoholism and addiction is within that umbrella. It's not a moral failing, unfortunately, and that's part of the stigma that we thought that it is.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the questions I get about my the father of my son who passed away, I really have to practice what I learn in the rooms because it's a question. There are targeted toward there being moral failings for him, right? And it was just the problem is he had severe depressive disorder, and so that's not treated. They treat with alcohol, and their dopamine receptors just go crazy. I mean It's incredible, and I truly, the one thing I am grateful for is going to Family Week during rehab to have a medical doctor explain how that happens and that it's actually a disease. And I am definitely of the disease theory. I realize there are some people who do not believe that it is a disease, but I do believe it is. And it is a family. It's learned. There's lots of different contributing factors to it, but for sure that is the case. So then you passed the bar?
I did. It took me a couple of tries, but I did pass the bar.
That's not uncommon.
And that was another test. I mean, honestly, I don't think I've ever talked publicly about this. I passed the bar exam on my third try. And that was probably one of the biggest tests of my strength and recovery, was going through that. There is an enormous amount of pressure to pass the bar. There's an enormous amount of shame associated with not passing it. And I think the most at risk I've ever been was after finding out I did not pass the second time. And I remember I'd been sober for more than a decade at this point, but I remember thinking to myself, like, I'm in danger right now. Like the stuff that I'm thinking about is really old thoughts. And very, very negative self-talk. And
did you have thoughts of use or drinking or anything like that?
I I didn't really. I was fantasizing about self-sabotage, right? It was like, where could I disappear to? And I think in the back of my mind, knowing like, yeah, if I just like, because the shame of failing something so enormous was like, well, I'll just leave the country, you know? Obviously, if I leave the country secretly or whatever, um, I'm gonna do drugs there. No one will know me, right? So I think that was implicitly part of my plan, right? But all of this is just a reaction to shame, and disappointing other people, and it just brings up a lot of the claws that addiction gets into you, especially towards the beginning of early recovery. I felt that again. And so that was a time when I was able to not pull myself up by my bootstraps, but utilize the resources that I had in my community and the loved ones that I had in my personal life to get, at least strong enough to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Did you call your sponsor?
Yeah, I did, absolutely. The calls became a little more regular during that time. And yeah, that was a very difficult time. I did eventually pass the bar exam.
And here, as we sit here today, you're a lawyer and nobody cares how many times you had to take it. I mean, it's kind of like they say, the person that graduates the bottom of the class at Harvard is still a Harvard law grad.
It's true.
Right?
It's true.
And you're a lawyer. I mean, and nobody says, oh, well, how many times did it take you to pass it? It doesn't matter. You passed a very, very, very hard exam.
Yes. And yeah, nobody cares now. And I'm happy to have passed it. I definitely have some feelings that aren't relevant to this podcast about the bar exam.
Well, there have been discussions of getting rid of it, but that's another podcast, right?
Yeah. That was a challenging time for me. But what I ended up doing was kind of decatastrophizing that process. It's a tenet of stoicism of imagining all the worst possible outcomes of a scenario, and then trying to live through them in your head so that you're okay with them when they do happen. And so I just started making a bunch of contingency plans. Like, okay, if I don't pass again, I'm not going to take it again. This is ridiculous. Like, what are my other options? And I had like 4 or 5 other options that didn't involve fleeing the country and getting loaded, right? I had started this whole onboarding process with the FBI, and I had looked at, other, non-security clearance related, JD preferred programs where I could still put my foreign policy experience to use. And that felt much more productive than just like sitting in.
Not doing anything. And shame. Yeah. Or self-pity or whatever you want to call it. So you're a lawyer now, and as we know, in the legal profession, there's a lot of alcohol around, which is this year I've tried to make sure that we always have non-alcoholic options or mocktails if that's what people want to do. How do you find that to be true? And, what kind of practice do you have that keeps you from sort of being, what's the word I'm looking, not threatened by it, but being, you know what I mean? Partaking in what keeps you from partaking in the activity? I
think it is it's a I don't know, traditional kind of deal in attorney culture. We are a by design insular culture professionally. We're self-governing, and I think that we're also very exclusive. There's multiple barriers to admission, and so really old-timey stuff is still around. Drinking. I mean, people don't really drink at the office anymore, but
they did at one point.
They did, yeah. I mean, during our lifetimes, they absolutely have. There's probably some buildings around here where they're still doing it, but it's kind of an old thing, right? But still, it's glamorized in popular culture. Attorneys partying really hard and then looking like super sharp in the morning.
I can't remember that show. It had Denny Crane.
Boston Legal.
Yes, Boston Legal. And you remember every night or every day at the end of the day, they pour, a scotch or a bourbon or whatever and go out. Literally, that's what the world portrays us. And that's not who we all are.
No, most people are more like, Better Call Saul.
Yeah, most people are like, I'm tired. I'm going to go home and go to bed, like me after 3 days of depositions this week.
Yeah. I think, and that specifically, if this is going to be on the podcast, the Kimberly Wexler character on Better Call Saul, is a pretty accurate portrayal of just a normal person who is an attorney, right? But to answer your question about the alcohol thing, like it's undeniably part of like lawyer culture. It doesn't really affect me that much. I don't really think about it that much. People say things like, "Hey, we'll get a beer together," or "Let me buy you a beer." And it's like, I don't drink, but we can go out for a cup of coffee or something, you know. It's never been something that is invasive or hurtful to me. I've also never felt like it damages my ability to meet new people and network with other attorneys and find, job opportunities, anything like that. My sobriety and my recovery has always, my strategy to begin with when I went to law school was I'm going to use it as a sword and not a shield. I'm going to be open with this the whole time, and it'll be just a filter. I mean, I went to OCI interviews, and every single OCI interview I did, I talked about being in recovery. And you could always tell when it was like, if drinking is a big part of their firm culture, it made them uncomfortable, yes. And it's funny because nowadays, I guess, there's kind of a moral obligation when you hear, or a social obligation when someone's like, yeah, I'm in recovery, to be like, oh, that's so great. I'm so that's
I'm proud of you.
amazing. We're all so
Congratulations.
proud of
Yeah.
you. Yeah. But there are lots of people when they hear it, they're like,
Really? And I'm trying to change the culture. You and I spoke at Bench Bar, and I talked a little bit about this. I want to change the culture at law firms, right? So when you hear somebody's in recovery, that's a good thing. A recovery is a spiritual awakening, almost like, you build this emotional intelligence. You build your emotional intelligence muscles in a way that a lot of people don't. They don't have the ability to, like you said, seeing through the prism or whatever. They don't have the ability to understand themselves in that way, right? And so it's such a gift. But also, when people are struggling, not to push them aside, to try to say, let me help you. Because, like you said, we are very insular, we are very connected, and we are a very young culture, so we should be looking out for one another.
I agree. I think for employers and law firm partners who are involved in hiring and managing attorneys, especially young attorneys, it's got to be a tightrope to walk if we're looking into this, right? Because if I'm pitching it and selling, hiring people in recovery, I would say, like, look, you're going to hire a young attorney anyway, so they're not going to know anything anyway, right? You could be hiring someone who intrinsically has way more life experience, has experienced more pain, has had to display more courage and dedication. That's probably the personality that you want as an associate of your firm.
Especially given how much stress we get put under, somebody who knows how to handle the stress and is not going to go to the bottle or to pot or whatever.
But at the same time, let's say I'm pitching this to law partners. By the way, if they relapse, you might never see them again.
Yes. Or they might not do their time, or, they might not return telephone calls, and that's true. That's part of it. But I think to stick your head in the sand and as a law firm and think it doesn't happen is a little bit short-sighted, because it's
happening already.
Yeah. I mean, this profession, we talk about it, secondary trauma, especially in your line of work. I mean, family law is extremely difficult. But all of us are generally like people of service. We want to help people. We want to fix problems. And sometimes they're very hard problems, and sometimes they can't be fixed. And getting through that, what I call the messy middle, is hard in a case, and it can be very taxing on you. And that's regardless of whatever kind you practice. Even if you're transactional, if you're in a big deal, it's stressful, right? People are screaming at each other or talking snarky to one another to, try to bargain to get a better deal. And so it's ripe for addiction.
It really is. And I think that there is an old-fashioned culture that is still carried through many firms and many practices, probably not intentionally, of very rigid structures of management and very rigid ideas about performance and metrics, and also about optics.
And very rigid ideas about self-care.
True.
It doesn't exist. There's no such thing.
Right. And yeah, the idea that, like, I mean, it's generational ideas about, like, whether therapy is useful or something.
Or can you just have a mental health day? Do you need a break, right?
Right. And the idea of a mental health day being a joke, right? And I think we have a generation of people who we have great attorneys who have worked very, very hard to get where they are. And they've done so without the benefit of any kind of cultural discussion about mental health that might have helped them or their loved ones, without any kind of, at least not in an open way, right? Many older attorneys have grown up without the resources that we do now, in an environment where it wasn't safe to discuss mental health, addiction, alcoholism, sexuality, all kinds of things, right? And so if we're trying to understand a perspective that is possibly damaging, I think it makes sense because none of this was familiar and it could have helped a lot of people probably. But now that it's here, I think anyone who is in charge of young attorneys or new attorneys has the responsibility to be aware of, hey, it's not a moral failing. There is an approach to this that looks like we want to help you be healthy. And balancing that with a business perspective, like, okay, if I have healthy associates, they will bill and collect, right? If you're in that model, right? And we will do better economically as a firm. If I don't pay any attention to that, whether I believe in mental health days or not, you can get metrics on whether or not paying attention to your employees' mental health is going to help.
Or following healthy boundaries. I mean, the days of, I do trial work. So yes, on weekends you have to work. But the days of having to work every single weekend and never getting a day off and working at 8 o'clock at night and getting emails from partners at 9 o'clock at night saying, do this immediately, those days are probably gone.
I think so. And a lot of those are from a different time. I mean, we have instant communication and we can collate and synthesize information at a greater rate than ever before. It's rarely the situation where it's an emergency, right? Even in family law, very rarely is something an emergency, right? I mean, I think that the idea that there's a difficult balance between the service that we give to our clients, which we want that to be great. We want that to be unilaterally fantastic. We want our clients to be happy with level of communication, whatever the expectation is at any firm, whether they expect to be able to call and have a partner answer the phone or whether they expect to be able to send an email and get a response by the end of the day, whatever the expectation is, we want to make sure that happens, but not at the cost of the actual attorneys that are holding all of this up. And boundaries are something that I'm seeing much, much more often. I work at a firm where this is absolutely encouraged and absolutely supported.
100%. Right? Same here.
As long as the work gets done, clients aren't always going to be happy. I mean, we could do all of this. We could have no boundaries and clients might still not be happy. But if you look at it over a long enough time span, I think that we provide better service when we pay attention to the mental health of the associates at our firms.
It goes back to the airplane mask. Like if they say put your mask on before you help anybody else, we've got to take care of ourselves. And people have to recognize that that's important. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just thinking that airplane mask when you were saying that. And
that's absolutely true. Right. We have, in family law, and I know that this is true in other fields as well, but just speaking for myself, the level of responsibility that we often find ourselves in is huge and can be shocking sometimes.
Daunting at times.
With children involved in a case, especially. But even, compared to the well-being of a child, a multi-million-dollar community property estate doesn't feel anywhere near as important, right? But for, different cases feeling different types of pressure, you never know. But if I'm not healthy, if I don't have, the airplane mask on, how can I be of service to my client? And what if I'm not healthy enough and I can't show up for my client in the way that I have a duty to do, that I took an oath, to do.
And you're bound by ethical obligations that require you to do it. Yeah.
And so if I'm managing other attorneys, I want to enable them to be the very best that they can be and place them in an environment where success is more likely than not. And if that's the case, maybe the billable hour requirement should be lower. Maybe Like maybe mental health days are okay and encouraged. Like we'll find coverage. At the same time, I recognize that like
You got to make money.
you got to make money. And going back to the Al-Anon thing, like this doesn't mean that we keep an active alcoholic addict at the firm knowingly, right? I think it's tough to know like we're providing resources, make sure people have options, but also like you can't rep a client drunk, you know? And at some point, a firm might be enabling a person, which, you know, raises other questions like who at the firm is going to make these decisions? You know, do we have like a human resources person? Do we have someone who feels comfortable making those decisions? Education, like in our community might make people feel more empowered to deal with that.
Or have a conversation with a person and encourage them to go seek treatment, you know, because again, once you go through treatment and recovery, you're incredible, you know, just the way you see the world and your ability to handle stress just really changes, you know, and in a good way.
Yes, it absolutely can. I would recognize that I'm very much an outlier in my success in recovery and professionally. It is uncommon for alcoholic addicts to survive as long as I have, or not end up in a jail or an institution. So there is no magic, you know, bullet. There's no, you know, perfect solution to the disease of addiction or substance use disorder. All we know is there's a series of things that we can try doing that generally seem to help people find their own way into recovery. Frustrating as it is, it's kind of the best we've got. And many of those things we've identified worked and helped me.
Right. And I think too, you know, that just you keep saying put one foot in front of the other. I mean, truly one foot in front of the other. And the first foot is to say, I don't have control of anything. I've lost control, you know, and then go to a meeting.
Right. And that's difficult in early recovery and late recovery, difficult as an attorney, because a lot of times ends justify the means. We look at like, okay, what's the end game here? What's the result? What do I need to get here? I mean, you look at client goals, you look at case goals, or zooming out further, like I wanted to pass the bar exam, you know, like very specific professional goals, or like I want to get board certified. But in recovery, it's very much, you know, journey before destination. And that has to be a concept that's applied.
I mean, I think life in general just works better that way, right?
Yes, which is easy to say.
It is easy to say.
And it's easy to be like, for sure, that's it right there. But when we stop being mindful about that on a regular basis, in my experience, tend to slip back into the, okay, I've got to do this, and this. And if I don't, I'm a failure. Right? And it's like, okay, well, intellectually, that's not true, right? Maybe we do need to do these things, but it doesn't reflect morally on you. That's just something that your brain is telling you.
And I think we said this when we had a meeting together. If I'm always open to help someone go to an Al-Anon meeting, and they can call me at any time and find me online, and I will go to a meeting with them. And I think you said the same, right? Another way to reach out if you think you might have a problem is the people who are in recovery are happy to walk with you into that first meeting.
Yes, and it's especially those who got into recovery through the 12-step program, through AA. It is programmed into me. I am physically incapable of not saying, yes, I'd be happy to, or returning a phone call to help out. And it's not, you know, it's never going to be a burden. Actually, it's great. It's great for the alcoholic who gets the call. I was like, yeah, of course. Like,
I'll stop what I'm doing right now. I mean, I get it, you know, I get a lot of those, and like, what do I do? You know, and I always say, go to Al-Anon. And that's your first step, just realize, you know, and to help, the first step is like, I'm powerless, right? But you brought up a good point, and then we need to wrap up. But you said if AA and the 12 steps, and so you got sober through AA and the 12 steps. But there are other methodologies that are out there for people to use to get sober, correct?
Absolutely. I did get sober through the 12 steps. I think that statistically, it has the greatest level of success. The 12-step programs also benefit from being the most predominantly used and socially available and culturally relevant form of recovery. It is not the only way, And it also doesn't necessarily have to be as orthodox as the 12-step program is sometimes presented.
Right. The 90 days in 90 days.
There's all kinds of extra rules and it would take forever to get into all the orthodoxy of Alcoholics
That's a whole
Anonymous.
nother podcast,
It
right?
is. But there are lots of ways to be in recovery. I think some are easier than others. I think that the beauty of AA and the 12-step program is the way it's presented and the simplicity of it. That is how, so I can speak from experience, that worked for me.
And hearing other people like you tell their story. And I do want to say that there are so many in the greater Austin area AA meetings and Al-Anon meetings, and you can find them online. And when I say there's so many, I'm talking about multiple breakfast meetings, multiple, midday meetings, multiple evening meetings, all times of the day, all around the city. And so we'll drop the links for both of those at the bottom of the podcast, and people can see that. If you had one thing to tell somebody who is a lawyer, who is struggling with addiction, what is something you would tell them?
I would tell them that it's okay to ask for help. You said one thing, but as a lawyer, I've got to give you multiple answers.
Of course. It's funny. I asked you a question a second ago, and I said correct, and I was like, "Can you tell I've been in a deposition all week?" My lawyer questions came out.
You'd have something to tell an addict, isn't that true?
He knows it.
That it's okay to ask for help. That the culture of the practice of law has changed and is still changing, and that this doesn't have to be the end of everything. I have absolutely spoken to attorneys who feel as if when people find out that they're struggling with alcoholism or addiction, their careers will be over. Their spouses will leave them. They'll be disbarred. 100% not true. You can be an alcoholic addict and also be an attorney. If you want to continue practicing, you probably need to get into recovery. But there is a way out, right? So what I would say is, if you don't like the way your life is right now, it is possible for it to change. That there is a way to change that for the better. And there is a way to feel like happiness is possible. And at some point, not immediately, you can feel good about yourself. You can like yourself and love yourself as you are.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's podcast. Don't forget, on the Austin Bar's website, we do have a Stop the Stigma webpage that will give you additional resources like TLAP and the suicide hotline and multiple other ways to get sober and stay sober or seek out help for your mental health. You are definitely not alone, and we're here to help you. Thank you so much.